Picture this. 2019. Germany is the king of Europe, powered by cheap Russian gas and limitless Chinese demand. By 2025, that model is dead. Industrial production has collapsed, while its neighbor Poland is seeing record growth. By the end of this video, you will understand the structural elimination of the German economy and which emerging markets are actually worth your capital in 2026. Now strip away the headline drama and walk into the real scene. It is early morning in Bavaria in 2025. The parking lot is not empty, not yet, but it is thinner. Fewer vans, fewer trucks waiting at the gate. Inside, the machines are still there, the lights are still on, the coffee is still bitter, and the language of normality is still being spoken. Management calls it restructuring. Berlin calls it transition. Brussels calls it adjustment. But on the factory floor, everyone understands the simpler truth first. The overtime is gone. The next line is delayed. The supplier invoice is being renegotiated. The energy contract that used to be annoying is now existential. The Chinese orders are softer. The margin is thinner. The new investment is no longer assumed to belong in Germany. That is how industrial decline usually begins. Not with a cinematic collapse, but with a series of quiet subtractions. And that is the thesis of this story. Prosperity built on subsidized dependencies is not strength. It is rented stability. Germany rented energy it did not control, demand it did not command, and a geopolitical environment it could not preserve. Poland watched that model break and move faster than most investors still realize. For the factual backbone behind this opening, Germany's 2025 GDP only barely grew again, while energy-intensive industrial output in 2025 was still 8% below 2021 levels. Poland's 2021-21 levels. Poland's 2025-2026 growth outlook remains materially stronger. The German model was admired for so long that many investors stopped asking what exactly was carrying it. The answer was not simply productivity. It was productivity amplified by three forms of external support that behaved like hidden subsidies. The first was energy. For years, Germany's industrial machine benefited from large volumes of relatively cheap Russian pipeline gas. That mattered far beyond household heating. It shaped chemicals, metals, glass, fertilizers, ceramics, and the broader manufacturing chain built on predictable baseload costs. When that input broke, Germany did not just lose a fuel source, it lost the cost assumption embedded inside an entire industrial architecture. Even in 2025, energy-intensive industrial production was still 8% below 2021 levels. That is not a normal cyclical bruise. That is evidence of a damaged production base. The second was demand. Germany's export model worked because the world, and especially China, could absorb premium industrial output at scale. For years, that looked like strategic brilliance. In reality, it created concentration risk. China remained one of Germany's largest trading relationships in 2025, with total goods trade of 252 billion euros. 2 billion euros. But what once looked like a guaranteed growth engine has become a harder, more political, and more competitive market. German firms are no longer selling into the same external environment that made the old model feel invincible. The third was time. Germany deferred difficult physical adjustments because the old model kept paying. As long as gas stayed cheap, exports stayed strong, and financing conditions stayed easy, there was no immediate pressure to redesign the system underneath. That is how mature countries get trapped. They confuse the long survival of a model with the permanence of a model. So when the break finally came, many observers looked at GDP first and concluded that the damage was manageable. But GDP is a smoothing mechanism. It can hide industrial decay for longer than people think. Germany did return to slight growth in 2025, just 0.2%, supported in part by consumption. But that headline coexisted with much weaker industrial reality. A country can still look stable in aggregate, while the productive core that made it rich is quietly losing altitude. That is the trap of subsidized dependencies. They do not fail all at once. They fail in layers. And Germany's deepest layer was never finance. It was physical production. Germany's energy problem is often described as if it were a price shock. That is too flattering. A price shock suggests something temporary, something that can be hedged, subsidized, or waited out. Germany's deeper problem is physical. It is a problem of delivery, transmission, timing, and industrial geography. The country made a long transition toward a more renewable heavy power system without building the transmission backbone fast enough to carry that power reliably from where it is produced to where industry actually needs it. Wind generation is strongest in the north. Much of the industrial demand sits farther south and west. That mismatch has been understood for years. The issue was never ignorance, it was delay. By 2025, regulators were still celebrating incremental approvals for major north-south transmission projects like Suedlink, Suedostlink, and A-Nord, because the system is still catching up to a build-out that should have happened much earlier. Suedostlink's final section was only approved in July 2025. Suedlink's last planning approval came in October 2025. A-Nord's last section was approved in April 2025. These are milestones, yes, but they are also confessions. A system that needs this many final approvals in 2025 is admitting that the physical correction arrived years late, and even that is not the end of the story. Germany's 2025 monitoring report still shows the scale of the task ahead. The transmission system operators are planning around 7,850 kilometers of new lines and reinforcements by 2045. That is the kind of number that tells you this is not a quick repair. It is a generational retrofit. This matters to investors because industry does not purchase energy in the abstract. It purchases deliverable power at a usable price with enough reliability to justify long-horizon capital expenditure. If that confidence weakens, the first thing to move is not the existing plant. It is the next plant. That is why Germany's industrial problem is so dangerous. Existing factories can survive pain for longer than people expect. Governments can cushion households. Utilities can improvise. Accountants can smooth the shock. But new investment is ruthless. It asks a colder question. Where should the next 10 years of production go? And once capital starts asking that question, Germany no longer looks like the automatic answer. Der Status reported that manufacturing output fell again in 2025, the third straight annual decline, while energy-intensive branches remained well below pre-crisis levels. That tells you the issue is not simply sentiment. It is impaired industrial physics. This is what makes the problem feel 20-year unfixable. Not because Germany cannot build, but because infrastructure delayed for 20 years does not become strategically on time just because permits finally arrive. Poland did not become attractive because it discovered a secret. It became attractive because it stayed closer to industrial reality. For years, Poland was treated by Western Europe as a lower-cost extension of the core, a place for assembly, logistics, labor arbitrage, and supplier overflow. That view is now outdated. Poland is no longer just a cheaper production site. It is becoming a platform country, a place where energy strategy, geography, infrastructure, tax friction, labor depth, and political alignment are combining into a more durable investment case. Start with growth. While Germany only scraped back to 0.2% GDP growth in 2025, Poland expanded much faster. The European Commission projected Poland at 3.3% in 2025 and 3.0% in 2026, supported by domestic demand and investment. That does not automatically make Poland safer than Germany in all respects, but it does tell you where momentum has shifted. Then look at taxes and capital friction. Poland's standard corporate income tax is 19%, with a reduced 9% rate for certain small taxpayers. Germany's combined corporate tax burden is typically around 30%. Once federal corporate tax, solidarity surcharge, and municipal trade tax are included, investors do not relocate entire industrial chains over tax alone. But when energy, labor, and logistics are already in play, tax friction becomes part of the deciding margin. Now add energy pragmatism. Poland has its own serious energy problems, especially its legacy dependence on coal. But unlike Germany, its posture has often been less theological and more transitional. It has expanded LNG access through Wynuage to Z, advanced the Baltic pipe connection to Norwegian gas, and pushed ahead with new electricity infrastructure while also pursuing its first nuclear program. That is not elegance. It is something more important, optionality. And at street level, this changes behavior. When firms compare two maps of Europe, they are not just comparing wages. They are comparing delay risk, power risk, permit risk, tax drag, and whether suppliers, warehouses, roads, and subcontractors can scale with them. Germany still has deeper capital markets, stronger industrial expertise, and a richer installed base. But for the next factory, the next supplier campus, the next logistics hub, Poland increasingly looks less like Europe's workshop and more like one of Europe's answers. This is where many investors make the next mistake. They see Poland rising, Vietnam rising, India rising, and they assume the old formula still works. Find cheaper labor, lower costs, and ride the catch-up story. That formula is already decaying. Cheap labor countries can grow fast for a while, but they usually hit the same wall. Wages rise. Demographics tighten. Infrastructure lags. Energy imports become a vulnerability. The legal and tax system remains too shallow for complex capital. Then the country discovers that being inexpensive is not the same thing as being indispensable. A platform country is different. A platform country is not merely where production is cheap. It is where production can survive stress. It has usable power. It has transport corridors. It has access to large markets. It has institutions good enough for contracts to matter. It has labor deep enough to move beyond assembly. It has political positioning that attracts supply chains instead of frightening them away. Most importantly, it gives capital a reason to stay after the wage advantage begins to fade. That is why Germany's decline and Poland's ascent are part of the same lesson. The winning jurisdiction in the next decade will not be the country with the lowest payroll. It will be the country that can offer manufacturers, data centers, logistics firms, and strategic capital a stable operating surface under pressure. Look at the contrast. A cheap labor story says, "Come here because workers cost less." A platform story says, "Come here because the system works." Those are not the same investment category. The first attracts opportunistic capital. The second attracts sticky capital, and sticky capital is what changes a country's future. It brings supplier ecosystems, managerial depth, technical training, infrastructure upgrades, financing relationships, and eventually local champions. Once that flywheel begins, the country stops being just a beneficiary of relocation and starts becoming a node that the wider system depends on. That is the real Poland pivot, not simply lower wages than Germany, not simply lower taxes, but a growing chance that, in a more fractured world, Poland is closer to being operationally necessary. And that is also the warning for every supposed emerging market miracle in 2026. If the country cannot convert growth into platform status, the advantage is temporary. So here's the protocol. In 2026, stop asking first which emerging market is cheapest. Ask which one can keep the lights on, move goods, honor contracts, absorb capital, and remain strategically useful when the global system turns hostile. That is what I mean by energy sovereignty, not total self-sufficiency. Very few countries have that. I mean the ability to secure enough energy through domestic production, diversified imports, infrastructure, and political realism that industry can function under stress. By that standard, the matrix is clearer than most market storytelling suggests. Poland, not flawless, but increasingly attractive. Strong 2026 growth outlook around 3–5%. Improving strategic energy optionality, EU market access, and rising platform status. India, powerful scale, deep domestic demand, and strong projected 2026 growth at 6.4%, but still vulnerable to imported energy shocks and logistics unevenness. A giant market, yes, not a frictionless industrial surface. Vietnam, efficient, export-oriented, and still fast-growing, but more exposed to external trade conditions and tariff risk than the narrative usually admits. The IMF country page shows 2026 projected growth at 5.6%, while the World Bank's 2025 update projected 6.5%, which tells you the outlook has become more contested. Brazil, resource-rich and more energy-endowed than many peers, but with weaker 2026 growth around 1-6% and a more uneven reform and fiscal story. Better as a selective exposure than a clean platform thesis. So move your money where the power is, not where labor is cheapest, not where headlines are loudest, where the system can still function when the subsidies die. That is the choice. Either you invest in appearances, or you invest in survivability.